before we dive into the next exciting story, drop a comment below and let me know, what time is it where you're watching from? I'm curious to see where everyone's tuning in from around the world.
I thought I knew isolation. I'd spent years driving across the country chasing celestial events, camping in places no one else dared to go. Black Rock Desert was supposed to be no different. I'd chosen this spot because it was one of the darkest places in the United States. Far from the light pollution of cities, with nothing but the stars above and the cracked earth below. A perfect place to watch the meteor shower I'd been anticipating for months. But the desert has a way of getting under your skin. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun blazing high, its rays bouncing off the endless white of the salt flats. The ground stretched out in every direction, flat and featureless, interrupted only by distant mountains rising like ghosts on the horizon. It was beautiful in a desolate way, the kind of place that makes you feel small and insignificant, exactly what I needed. The RV's engine rumbled to a stop, kicking up dust as I parked. I opened the door, stepping into the dry, hot air. The silence was immediate. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of civilization, just a profound, almost oppressive stillness. I told myself it was peaceful, that this was what I wanted. A few days alone in the desert to focus on my photography and watch the night sky. But as I looked out over the vast expanse of cracked earth, a strange feeling settled in my chest, like a weight pressing down. I brushed it off. It had been a long drive and the heat was getting to me. I'd feel better once the sun went down. I spent the first few hours setting up camp, adjusting my telescope, and testing my camera equipment. The sky was still a blazing blue, but the desert's unforgiving heat was beginning to fade, replaced by a sharp chill as the sun sank lower. By the time dusk arrived, the temperature had plummeted, and I retreated into the RV to grab a jacket before stepping back outside. That's when the radio first crackled to life. I'd brought my old ham radio along, hoping to catch some weather updates or maybe listen in on local astronomy broadcasts. I hadn't expected much out here, but the static-filled hum surprised me. I turned the dial, searching for a signal, and for a moment I thought I'd found one, a faint voice cutting through the static. "Don't stay." I froze. The words were barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind, but they were unmistakable. I leaned closer, adjusting the frequency, but the voice was gone, replaced by the familiar hiss of static. I turned the radio off, chalking it up to interference, old equipment, or weird atmosphere. Still, the unease in my chest was growing. The first night was incredible. The sky came alive with meteors streaking across the blackness, more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. I stood in awe, snapping pictures, adjusting my telescope, completely losing track of time. Out here, under the stars, the rest of the world felt far away. It was just me, the night, and the vastness of space. And yet, something nagged at me. When I reviewed the photos later, I noticed something strange in the background of one of my long exposure shots. There was a blur, a faint, almost imperceptible smudge. At first, I thought it was a mistake, dust on the lens maybe, or a glitch in the camera's settings. But as I scrolled through the rest of the images, the blur appeared again and again in each photo. It seemed to be getting closer to the RV. I wiped the camera lens, took another shot, and stared hard at the screen. Nothing. It had to be some kind of artifact from the desert air, the heat mixing with the cold night, playing tricks on the lens. Still, the feeling in my chest tightened. I turned in early, trying to push the unease aside, telling myself I'd check the equipment in the morning. Day 2 was different. I woke to a stifling heat that even the RV's air conditioning couldn't seem to fight. I cursed, fiddling with the controls, but the air blowing through the vents was weak and warm. I grabbed a bottle of water and stepped outside, hoping the breeze would provide some relief. But the air was dead still as the grave. I spent most of the day trying to fix the RV's engine, which had been acting sluggish since I arrived. I knew I should be enjoying the desert, but the more time I spent out there, the more the silence started to gnaw at me. It wasn't the peaceful isolation I had expected. It felt watchful. As the day dragged on, the sun beat down, turning the ground beneath my feet into a furnace. The radio, which had been quiet since last night's strange transmission, crackled to life again. This time, the voice was clearer. "Danger. You need to leave." I dropped the wrench I was holding, staring at the radio in disbelief. The voice was faint, distorted like it was coming from miles away. But it was unmistakable. Someone or something was speaking to me. I snatched up the radio, twisting the dial, trying to find the source. Static. Nothing but static. The voice was gone again, leaving me standing in the middle of the desert, sweat running down my back, my heart hammering in my chest. I should have left then. I should have packed up and driven out of there. But the RV's engine was still stalling, and part of me didn't want to admit that I was spooked. This was why I came out here, wasn't it? To face my fears, to be alone in the dark. I stayed. And that night, the shadows came. The meteor shower was more intense on the second night, the sky alive with fire and light. I sat by the RV, staring up at the heavens, the vastness of the universe overwhelming. But no matter how beautiful the stars were, my eyes kept drifting back to the edges of the desert, where the darkness seemed to pool, thick and impenetrable. It was there, at the far edge of my vision, that I first saw the figure, a shape standing just beyond the reach of my campfire's light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the eye. The desert plays with your perception. Distances blur, shadows stretch. But when I blinked, the figure was still there, standing, watching. I grabbed my camera, adjusting the focus, snapping a shot before the figure disappeared. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe an animal or even another camper who'd wandered too close. But when I checked the camera's screen, my blood went cold. The figure wasn't human. It was tall. Too tall, with elongated limbs and a strange, distorted form. It was like a shadow brought to life, a smear of darkness against the starlit sky. The more I stared at it, the more unreal it looked. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and I slowly lowered the camera. When I looked again, the figure was gone. The air was suddenly freezing, the kind of cold that bites at your skin. I retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me, my heart racing. I told myself I was imagining things. The desert played tricks on people. I'd read about it, people seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices carried on the wind, but that didn't explain the figure in the photo. The night dragged on, and I stayed awake, listening for anything, any sound, any movement. But all I heard was the persistent hum of the radio and the static growing louder by the minute. The next day, I knew I had to leave. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just my imagination. The figure, the voices, I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. I packed up as quickly as I could, but when I turned the key in the ignition, the RV sputtered and died. I tried again and again, nothing. I stepped out into the desert, sweat pouring down my face. The heat was oppressive, and the silence pressed in on me, suffocating. I tried to call for help, but my phone had no signal, and the radio was useless. Just a constant, garbled stream of static. Then the voice returned, louder than ever. Stay, come closer. It wasn't a whisper anymore, it was a command. And when I looked out across the desert, I saw the figure again, closer this time, standing in the distance. Its form was hazy and indistinct, but unmistakable. It was waiting for me. My legs felt like lead as I backed toward the RV, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was freezing now, the warmth of the day gone, replaced by a bone-deep chill. I knew in that moment that if I stayed, I would become like the figure, a shadow, a ghost, trapped in this forsaken place, wandering the desert forever. I ran. I don't know how I got the RV started. Maybe it was adrenaline or maybe sheer panic. But when the engine finally roared to life, I slammed the gas pedal to the floor and didn't look back. The figure, the voice, the cold. They all faded into the distance as I sped across the salt flats, the desert stretching endlessly behind me. I never looked at the photos again. I couldn't. Whatever was out there, it was better left unseen. I'll never return to Black Rock Desert. Some places were meant to be empty. Before we dive into the next exciting story, drop a comment below and let me know, what time is it where you're watching from? I'm curious to see where everyone's tuning in from around the world. My name is Brian Gibson, and this all went down in late October 2020. I'm an architect by trade, but my real passion is the great outdoors. Every now and then, I take my RV and head to some off-the-beaten-path places. This time, I ended up near a small town in Western Virginia, the locals call Elk Ridge. I didn't think much of the name at the time. I brought along my friend Jimmy Rader. Jimmy's the kind of guy who always has a joke ready, and his upbeat attitude makes him great company. We'd been friends since high school, so it seemed natural to invite him on this little adventure. We were going to meet up with another buddy, Mark Crowley, who lived nearby and knew the area well. We parked the RV at a secluded spot by the forest's edge. It was picturesque, the kind of place where the worries of city life melt away. The trees were just beginning to turn colors, and there was a crispness in the air that hinted at the coming winter. The first day was all about setting up camp and catching up over some beers. Mark showed up around midday with a cooler full of venison steaks and some fishing gear. We planned to fish, grill, and maybe hike a bit. Simple stuff, relaxing stuff. The first odd thing happened that night. We just finished dinner and were sitting around the fire when we heard something rustling in the woods. At first, we thought it might be a deer, or maybe a raccoon, but the sounds were too deliberate, too heavy. Jimmy laughed it off, saying it was probably just our imaginations getting the better of us. Mark seemed a bit uneasy, but he didn't say anything. The next morning, we decided to hike up to an old lookout point Mark had mentioned. It was supposed to offer a spectacular view of the valley. The trail was overgrown, clearly not used much anymore. We reached the lookout around noon, and it didn't disappoint. You could see for miles, the forest stretching out in every direction with the distant mountains framing the horizon. On the way back, we found an old abandoned cabin. It was small, maybe a hunting lodge from decades ago. The roof had caved in on one side, and the door hung askew. Mark suggested we take a look inside. Jimmy, always the joker, said we might find treasure. What we found instead was a strange set of carvings on one of the remaining walls. They looked like symbols, maybe Native American or something older. None of us could make heads or tails of it, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. Jimmy snapped a few photos, making jokes about ancient curses, and we headed back to the RV. That night, things took a turn for the worse. We were sitting by the fire, again, swapping stories, when we heard the same rustling sound from the previous night. This time, it was closer. Mark suggested we call it a night and head inside. As we packed up the fire, something crashed through the underbrush nearby. It was big. Whatever it was, we all froze, listening. Jimmy, trying to lighten the mood, shouted, "Hey, Bigfoot, come join the party." There was no response, of course, just more rustling. We hurried into the RV and locked the doors. Inside, we tried to laugh it off, but the tension was palpable. Around midnight, I woke up to a loud, banging noise. It sounded like someone or something was trying to get into the RV. I shook Jimmy awake and grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed. We crept to the front of the RV where the banging was the loudest. Suddenly, the noise stopped. We waited, holding our breath. Then we heard a low, guttural noise. Not quite an animal growl, but not human either. It chilled me to my core. I glanced at Jimmy, his face pale in the dim light. Mark was still asleep, snoring softly in his corner. In the morning, we found deep scratches on the side of the RV, 3 parallel lines gouged into the metal. It wasn't something a bear or any local wildlife could do. Jimmy was visibly shaken, but he tried to play it off with another joke. Mark looked more worried than I'd ever seen him. He suggested we leave, but I convinced them to stay one more night. We were here to relax after all, we'd just be more cautious. We spent the day fishing at a nearby stream. The fish weren't biting much, but it felt good to be out in the open with the sun shining and the fresh air. Jimmy finally seemed to relax, and even Mark loosened up a bit. We returned to the RV with a small catch, just enough for dinner. As the sun set, we made a point of securing everything. We locked the RV doors, bolted the windows, and even set up a makeshift alarm system using some fishing line and empty cans. Jimmy joked that we were turning into survivalists, but I could see the unease in his eyes. That night, we sat inside playing cards and drinking whiskey. The mood was lighter, almost normal, until we heard it again. The rustling. This time, it was accompanied by a faint, almost rhythmic tapping. Tap, 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 tap. It was coming from the roof. We grabbed our makeshift weapons. Jimmy had a knife, Mark a heavy flashlight, and I had my bat. We cautiously moved to the front of the RV. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. Then it stopped, followed by a loud thud, as if something heavy had jumped off the roof. The next few moments were a blur. The RV rocked violently, and something slammed against the door. We could hear scraping and scratching, the sound of metal bending. Mark shouted for us to brace the door, and we all threw our weight against it. The assault stopped as suddenly as it had begun. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed huddled together, weapons at the ready, listening to the sounds outside. Dawn came slowly, and with it a decision. We were leaving. This was no longer a vacation. It was a fight for survival. As we packed up, we found more scratches, deeper this time, and what looked like blood smeared near the door. We didn't discuss it. We just moved as quickly as possible. Mark drove, and Jimmy and I kept watch, eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. We didn't see anything on the drive back, but the feeling of being watched never left. It was like an invisible weight pressing down on us. We finally reached civilization, and the relief was palpable. We parted ways, each of us eager to put the experience behind us, but it wasn't over. A few days later, I got a call from Mark. Jimmy had gone missing. His family reported that he never made it home. The police found his car abandoned on a back road near the forest. No sign of a struggle, no clues, just gone. I went back to Elk Ridge with Mark. We retraced our steps, hoping to find some hint of what happened. The forest felt different, darker, as if it was hiding something. We found Jimmy's car, but nothing else. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The police got involved, but there were no leads. Mark and I did our own investigation, talking to locals, searching every inch of the area. We found nothing but those strange symbols again, carved into a tree near where we had camped. They were similar to the ones in the abandoned cabin. Weeks turned into months, and there was still no sign of Jimmy. Mark became obsessed, spending more and more time in the forest. I tried to move on, but the memory of that night haunted me. I started researching local legends, trying to make sense of it all. That's when I came across stories of a creature, something ancient and malevolent, known to the local tribes as ZTH. The descriptions varied, but the common thread was its predatory nature and the way it could vanish without a trace. The symbols we saw were supposedly a warning to stay away from its territory. I don't know what happened to Jimmy, and I doubt I ever will. Mark still goes back to Elk Ridge, searching, hoping for answers. As for me, I've given up camping. The RV is parked in storage, gathering dust. I stick to the city now, where the only predators are human and the threats more predictable. The memory of that night remains a shadow that lingers at the edge of my thoughts. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that faint rhythmic tapping and wonder if ZTH is still out there, waiting. When you spend enough time alone, the silence becomes something else. It's no longer a backdrop, but a living, breathing thing that creeps in around the edges of your thoughts. I thought I liked the silence. That's why I had been living on the road for months, with no one but myself and my RV for company. But this trip to Ocala National Forest was supposed to be different. I needed to reset to get my head straight. I guess that's what they all say before they lose it. The first day was easy enough. I set up camp on the edge of the forest, not far from one of the swamps that ran through Ocala. I had picked this spot on purpose, far enough from the touristy campgrounds, but close enough to the water to take some good photos. Photography had become my new hobby, something to fill the long stretches of time, something to keep my mind off Rachel. The forest was thick with towering pines and oaks, their branches twisting and closing in overhead. The light filtered through the leaves in a way that made the air seem heavy, almost suffocating. But it was peaceful, or at least I told myself it was. I parked the RV near a clearing, right where the swamp met the woods. The ground was firm enough, and I didn't think much of the water nearby. I had no reason to worry, not yet. By the time I finished setting up, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing. The air was unnervingly still, like the whole forest was holding its breath, but I didn't mind. Solitude was the whole point. I sat outside for a while, watching the last of the light fade before retreating inside the RV. The hum of the small generator I had hooked up was the only sound breaking the silence. Everything seemed fine. Everything was fine, until the light started flickering. It was subtle at first, just a dimming of the overhead lights. I figured the wiring was faulty, Nothing I couldn't fix. I'm a mechanic by trade, after all. I ignored it, settling in with a book, trying to lose myself in the words. But then the flickering got worse. The lights flashed on and off in rapid succession. The shadows in the RV danced wildly before everything went dark. I sighed, more frustrated than anything, and grabbed my flashlight. After a few minutes of fumbling with the wires, I got the power back on. The lights stabilized, but there was something else. A soft buzzing noise, faint, just at the edge of hearing, like a distant hum. It might have been the swamp, maybe bugs, or just the generator straining, but it set me on edge. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, the unease I'd felt the night before was gone, replaced by a sense of calm. The sunlight was warm, and the swamp shimmered in the early light. I grabbed my camera and set out for a walk, looking for something worth capturing. Ocala was known for its beauty, the kind of untouched wilderness that's hard to find these days. But the deeper I walked into the woods, the more I realized something was off. It started small, little things I could have easily ignored. My compass acting up, the needle spinning lazily before settling in the wrong direction. The buzzing sound from the night before returned, louder now, seeming to come from all around me. I chalked it up to the swamp mosquitoes, maybe, or some malfunction with the generator still ringing in my ears. But when I came back to camp, I noticed the first real sign that something wasn't right. My gear, things I'd left on the picnic table outside, was scattered across the ground, not in a way that suggested wind either. The table had been cleared. My flashlight, the lantern, the tools I'd left out, all of them were scattered in a perfect line toward the swamp. I stopped, staring at the items. Someone had been here, or something. I'm not easily spooked, but my gut told me to get back inside, lock the doors. That night, I sat in the RV, every light on, clutching a lantern just in case the power flickered again. I told myself it was fine. Probably some animal. Bears get curious, right? But when the tapping started, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was soft at first, just a light tapping on the window, like something brushing against it. I glanced over, but didn't see anything. I convinced myself it was the wind, the branches moving in the breeze. But then the tapping came again, and again. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The swamp smelled foul, like rot and decay, and the buzzing sound was back, louder than ever. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the clearing, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, large, human-like prints, leading right up to the window of my RV. The mud was fresh, still wet from the swamp, and the prints were clear, but there were no other signs of anyone around, no trails leading away, just those prints, stopping right at the window. Then, nothing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to believe it was someone playing a prank, some camper messing with me, but I hadn't seen another soul since I got here. No cars at the trailhead, no signs of other campers nearby. I hurried back inside, locking the door, but I knew it wouldn't help. The feeling in my gut told me I was being watched. By the third day, I wanted out. I'd seen enough. But when I tried to start the RV, nothing happened. The engine clicked, but wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but the RV refused to start. Panic settled in. My phone had no signal this deep in the forest, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. The buzzing sound was louder now, constant, like a low hum in the back of my skull. I packed a bag and decided to hike out. Staying another night was out of the question. The trail was familiar enough, but something was different. The air was thick, stifling, and the swamp seemed to have crept closer. I hadn't noticed it before, but the water was rising, soaking the ground around my campsite. The once dry trail was now a muddy mess, slowing me down as I tried to navigate through the trees. And then I saw them. At first, they were just shadows moving between the trees, barely visible in the corner of my eye. I stopped, trying to focus, but every time I turned to look, they were gone. My heart raced. I pushed forward faster now, but the shadows followed me. They stayed just out of sight, flickering in and out of existence, like ghosts. By the time I reached the halfway point, the whispers started. It wasn't loud, just a faint, distant murmur, but it was unmistakable. Voices speaking in a language I didn't understand, too quiet to make out the words. I spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing, just the trees, the swamp, and those damn shadows. The trail blurred before my eyes, and I stumbled, my head swimming. I couldn't think straight. The buzzing, the whispers, it was too much. I needed to get out of here. But no matter which way I turned, the trail led me back to the swamp. It was like the forest was folding in on itself, trapping me in a maze of water and trees. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and then I saw them. Standing at the edge of the swamp, barely visible in the twilight, were the figures. They were tall, too tall to be human, with elongated limbs and dark faces. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching me, their forms flickering in and out of the shadows, like something half-formed, not fully real. I backed away, my heart pounding, but they didn't follow. They didn't need to. The buzzing sound grew louder, the whispers more insistent. I turned and ran, not caring where the trail led. I just needed to get away. When I finally collapsed back at the RV, drenched in sweat and mud, the sun was already setting. The swamp had crept even closer, the water now lapping at the edges of the clearing. I locked myself inside, every light on, but it didn't matter. I could still hear them, the whispers, the tapping, the buzzing. It all grew louder, closing in on me from every side. I knew what was out there. I'd seen it, and it was only a matter of time before it got in. I sat there in the dark, clutching the flashlight, waiting for the moment when the door would creak open, waiting for the shadows to finally step into the light. I don't know how long I sat there, hours, days. The buzzing is in my head now, a constant hum I can't escape. The figures are closer. I can see them outside, just beyond the trees. Their eyes are glowing in the darkness. They're waiting for me, and I'm not sure how much longer I can resist. My name's Jonathan Martin, and I've never had much of a conventional career. Growing up in rural Indiana, I was used to hard work. My father taught me to hunt at a young age, not for sport, but because it was necessary for survival. Living off the land became second nature, which I guess is why years later I got recruited by a very quiet branch of the US government. Most people have never heard of us. Those who have might think of us as conspiracy theorists with too much time on our hands. We hunt monsters. This time, they sent me to a place called Willow's Rest in Nebraska. It's a tiny, unremarkable town surrounded by cornfields that stretch for miles. Nothing much different from my own hometown. But something was very wrong here. The locals had reported disappearances. Farmers and travelers who had just gone missing, their bodies sometimes found days later, mauled beyond recognition. The local law enforcement called it wild animals, but they knew it wasn't. That's where we came in. I arrived under the cover of being an agricultural inspector. My government ID said I worked for the USDA, but my actual mission was something much darker. They partnered me with a guy named Garrett Moore, who'd been doing this longer than me, but was quieter than a snake in the grass. Garrett didn't talk much about his past, and I didn't pry. We'd been working together for a year, and already had an unspoken understanding. Don't ask questions unless it'll save your life. Willow's Rest wasn't any different from dozens of other towns I'd been to for these kinds of jobs. Quiet, polite, but with an underlying tension. The people were scared, though they didn't say it outright. It was in the way they watched the sky, how they didn't walk alone at night, and how they never seemed to talk about the things they'd seen. At first, I thought this might be just another cryptid, a large predator that had slipped into human territory, maybe something along the lines of a Wendigo or a skinwalker. But something felt off. Garrett and I spent a few days setting up surveillance in the cornfields surrounding the town. The corn grew tall, taller than I'd ever seen in Indiana. It reached above my head, swaying in the wind like an endless ocean of green and gold. We kept hearing reports of something large moving through the fields, and occasionally a gutted animal carcass was found near the edges. The locals were jumpy, but no one was talking openly. Something was keeping them quiet. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we set up a base camp on the edge of one of the largest cornfields. The owner, a nervous farmer named Clyde, gave us permission but wouldn't stay long enough to even discuss what he'd seen. "It's not natural," he muttered before speeding away in his old pickup. Garrett and I exchanged looks. We'd seen plenty of unnatural things, but whatever this was, it had gotten deep into the bones of these people. Night fell fast in those open fields. The sky was huge, stars sprinkled like salt over the black dome above us. We had rifles, tranquilizers, and an arsenal of other tools in case things got ugly. Around midnight, it started. At first, it was subtle, just a rustling in the corn that could have been the wind, but it was too deliberate. Then came the smell, a rancid, decaying stench that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Garrett nodded toward the field, and we both stood, weapons drawn, listening. The rustling grew louder, more erratic. Whatever it was big. I wasn't prepared for what came next. A shadow emerged from the corn, moving on all four paws, but not like any animal I'd ever seen. It was long and gaunt, its limbs grotesquely elongated like a spider's. The skin was gray and mottled, stretched tight over sharp bones that jutted out at odd angles. The head was canine in shape, but the mouth was wide, too wide, lined with rows of uneven teeth that reminded me of a shark. Its back arched unnaturally high, and its eyes, I didn't want to look at them, but I had no choice. They were black, empty, reflecting nothing. The thing moved with impossible speed, tearing through the cornfield toward us. Garrett fired first, a sharp crack splitting the night air. The creature veered fast enough to dodge the shot, but not entirely. It let out a sound somewhere between a scream and a roar, something primal and alien, as the bullet grazed its side. The smell of burning flesh hit my nose. Silver bullets, as usual. I fired next, aiming for its mass, and this time I hit it dead on. The creature staggered, but instead of dropping, it bolted back into the corn. We pursued, but it was like chasing a shadow through the fields. We lost it within minutes, but not before we stumbled across something far worse. In the clearing, there were bodies, or what was left of them. The stench of decay hit us like a punch to the gut. I counted 5, maybe 6 bodies, but it was hard to tell. They were in pieces, torn apart as if something had ripped into them with savage, deliberate force. Limbs were scattered, faces barely recognizable. One poor soul had been gutted, his insides spilling out into the dirt like a grotesque feast. Garrett knelt beside the bodies, his face a stone mask. "This thing's not just killing for food," he said flatly. "It's hunting." We returned to town with what little we had. A few blood samples, a torn piece of flesh from the creature, and our grim report. Clyde didn't ask questions when we told him to leave his farm. The sheriff didn't either when we recommended a full evacuation of the area. They trusted us, or maybe they were just too scared to defy whatever had taken hold of Willow's Rest. 2 nights later, we set up our final stand in the center of the cornfield. We lured the creature with fresh livestock, bound and bleeding, at the edge of the clearing. This time, we were ready. Infrared cameras, motion sensors, traps, everything we could muster. The creature came again, as we knew it would. It emerged from the darkness, slower this time, cautious, but we had the upper hand now. As it approached the bait, Garrett hit the trigger, and the trap sprang shut around it. Metal spikes impaled its legs, and it let out that awful scream again, thrashing wildly as we closed in. Up close, the creature was even more horrifying. Its skin was paper-thin, stretched tight over what looked like too many bones. It writhed and snarled as we raised our rifles, silver bullets aimed for its heart. "Let's finish this," Garrett said. We fired in unison. The bullets ripped through the creature's chest, and it collapsed in a heap of twitching limbs. For a moment, it lay still, and then its body began to convulse. We stood back, rifles still trained on it, but whatever energy it had left was draining fast. Finally, it stopped moving. I stood over the corpse, breathing hard, waiting for something else to happen, something worse. But nothing did. The thing was dead, and it wasn't coming back. The next morning, the locals came out of hiding. They didn't ask us questions. They didn't need to. Clyde packed up and left town for good, as did most of the others. Willow's Rest became a ghost town. In the weeks that followed, the fields grew wild and untamed. As for Garrett and me, we moved on to the next job, leaving the body of that thing where it lay. We never figured out what it was. Maybe we never would. All I know is that the cornfields of Willow's Rest were quiet now. Too quiet. But that suited me just fine. I should have known better than to trust an unmarked road. After years of travel writing, you'd think I'd have a sharper instinct for bad decisions. But there I was, driving deeper into the Ford Pinchot National Forest, chasing a forgotten trail that was supposed to lead me to a ghost town no one could find anymore. Vanished off the map. The ranger at the visitor center had said with a grin, "People go looking for it and never see it again. It's like the road just swallows you up." He laughed, but I could see the glint in his eye. He loved spinning those kinds of tales for tourists. But I wasn't a tourist. I was a writer. Damn it. I had an assignment to finish, and there was no room for ghost stories. I followed the narrow, crumbling logging road as it wound deeper into the trees. My RV rattled along, tires crunching over fallen branches and loose gravel. The road narrowed, barely wide enough for my rig, but I kept going. I'd done my research, and this was the right way, even if the forest seemed determined to reclaim the path. It had been a long day, and I was eager to set up camp and relax before exploring the area the next morning. The farther I went, the thicker the trees grew, their branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the late afternoon sun. My GPS had long since lost signal, but I didn't need it. I was prepared. I had maps. I was confident I didn't get lost easily. But as I rounded the last bend in the road, something changed. The sky had been clear earlier, but a dense fog was rolling in now, thick and fast. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The road, which had been clear just moments ago, seemed to dissolve into a gray blur. I slowed to a crawl, squinting through the windshield. Just up ahead, a small clearing appeared through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough room for me to park the RV. I didn't have many other options. I pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped outside. The fog clung to everything, making the air feel damp and cold. It shouldn't have been this cold. Not in early fall. The chill crept into my bones, but I pushed it aside and started setting up camp. Something about the silence gnawed at me, though. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness in that damned fog. I finished my setup quickly, then retreated to the warmth of the RV. I wasn't nervous, but the quiet was getting under my skin. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, settled into the driver's seat, and pulled out my maps. I spread them across the dash, looking for my next move. The ghost town was supposed to be less than a mile away, hidden deep in the woods, down a trail that was barely marked. Tomorrow I'd hike to it, get my pictures, take some notes, and be done with it. Easy. But something was off. The road I'd driven on wasn't showing up on the map anymore. I traced the route with my finger, confused. The road was here. I'd just come down it, but now on the map it wasn't anywhere to be found. I leaned back in my seat, staring out the windshield at the fog-shrouded forest. The ranger's words echoed in my mind. Vanished off the map. I laughed softly to myself. It was a joke, a tall tale to scare off amateur hikers. Nothing more. Still, when I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I felt it again, that unsettling stillness. The fog was thicker now, curling around the RV like tendrils. I looked back toward the road I'd driven in on, but it wasn't there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stepped forward, peering into the mist. No road, just an unbroken line of trees. My stomach tightened. I walked a few more steps, hoping the road would reappear, but it didn't. The forest was dense, the trees close together. There was no sign of the path I had taken just hours earlier. It was as if it had been swallowed whole. I jogged back to the RV, heart racing now. I grabbed my flashlight and marched back to where the road should have been, sweeping the beam through the fog, but all I could see were trees. Tall, dark, and oppressive. My breath fogged the air in front of me as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. The road couldn't just vanish. I hadn't gotten lost. I couldn't have. But when I turned back toward the RV, I felt it, that creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I swung the flashlight around, heart pounding, and for a split second I thought I saw movement in the fog. A figure, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. Hello? My voice cracked. I regretted speaking as soon as the word left my mouth. The fog swallowed my voice, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I scanned the tree line again. Nothing. I backed toward the RV, my nerves on edge, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't about to let a little fog and a missing road freak me out, but something felt wrong. The rational part of my brain was trying to make sense of it. Fog could play tricks on your eyes, and maybe I'd missed a turn somewhere. That was all. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. I spent the next hour pacing the length of the RV, checking and rechecking my maps, trying to retrace my route in my head. Nothing made sense. The road had been there. I hadn't imagined it. By nightfall, the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see more than a few feet outside. The temperature had dropped even more, and I cranked up the RV's heater, wrapping myself in blankets. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things. Soft thuds, like footsteps outside, and whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. It had to be the fog, I told myself. It was distorting sound, making me paranoid. But when I woke in the middle of the night, there were voices. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear them, faint, murmuring voices coming from outside. I crawled to the front of the RV, heart hammering, and peered through the windshield. The figures were back. This time there were more of them. Shadows in the fog, standing still, watching. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me. Cold, hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. I scrambled to turn on the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power. The RV was silent, cold, and dark. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the fog. I tried to stay calm, tried to think logically, but my heart was racing, my mind spiraling into panic. The road was gone, the figures were back, and now I was trapped here. I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket and burst out of the RV. The cold hit me like a slab. I marched toward where the road had been, determined to find it, but the forest had shifted. The trees were closer now, the fog denser. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape stayed the same. It was as if I was walking in circles. No matter which way I turned, I kept ending up back at the RV. I could hear the voices again, closer now. They echoed through the fog, indistinct and ghostly. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows appeared again. Closer this time, standing just beyond the beam of light. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me, my chest heaving. The figures were out there, circling me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. The fog pressed against the windows, and the shadows loomed outside, never coming closer but never leaving. Morning came, though I could barely tell. The fog hadn't lifted, and the road was still gone. I tried the engine again, and this time it roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I turned the RV around, driving slowly back the way I'd come. If the road was there, I couldn't see it. All I could do was follow the same path I'd taken before, hoping it would lead me out. But it didn't. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, a straight line through the fog, leading nowhere. And as I drove, I realized with sinking dread that I was still trapped. The road hadn't taken me anywhere. I was driving in circles, and the figures were still there, watching, waiting. They had me now. The vanishing road wasn't just a story. It was real, and I wasn't getting out. My name is Stephen Gibson, and this happened to me on a camping trip in the summer of 2018. I was out in the RV with my old college buddy, Sam Driscoll. We decided to take a break from our hectic lives and head out to the Ozarks in Arkansas. Sam and I go way back, and we thought a week away from everything would do us some good. We had this old RV, a beat-up Winnebago, that we pooled money together for back in our 20s. We've used it for countless trips, but this trip, was different. We arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon. The place was deserted, just the way we liked it. We set up camp, got the fire going, and cracked open a couple of beers. The forest was dense, the trees towering over us, their branches swaying gently in the wind. It was peaceful. After dinner, we sat by the fire reminiscing about the good old days. Sam mentioned how he hadn't been out camping in years and how it felt good to be back in nature. I nodded in agreement, the crackling fire casting shadows on our faces. The first night was uneventful. We slept well, the sound of crickets and the occasional owl hooting lulling us to sleep. It was the second night when things started to get strange. We were sitting around the campfire again, talking about nothing in particular, when we heard it, a rustling in the bushes just beyond the light of the fire. I shrugged it off, probably just a raccoon or something, but Sam got this look on his face, a look I hadn't seen in a long time. "You hear that, Frank?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah, probably just some critter," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. But the rustling didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. Sam stood up, grabbing the flashlight from the picnic table. He shined it toward the noise, but we couldn't see anything. Maybe we should check it out, he said, his eyes darting toward the dark woods. I sighed, not really wanting to leave the warmth of the fire, but agreed. We both grabbed flashlights and headed toward the noise. As we got closer, the rustling stopped. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shook it off. We stood there, flashlights scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Probably just an animal, I said again, trying to convince myself more than Sam. We headed back to the fire, trying to forget about it, but as the night wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I didn't say anything to Sam, but I could tell he felt it too. We decided to turn in early, hoping a good night's sleep would ease our nerves, but sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the RV, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every little noise made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it again, the rustling. This time, it was right outside the RV. I sat up, straining to hear. Sam was already awake, his eyes wide with fear. "You hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, grabbing the baseball bat I kept by the door. We slowly crept toward the front of the RV, trying to be as quiet as possible. I peeked out the window but saw nothing. Then there was a loud bang on the side of the RV. We both jumped, Sam grabbing a kitchen knife. I threw open the door, ready to swing, but there was nothing. Just the empty campsite and the dark woods beyond. We stood there for a moment, our breath heavy in the still night air. Then we heard it again, the rustling, but this time it was moving away from us, deeper into the woods. "Maybe we should leave," Sam said, his voice shaky. I nodded, but something inside me wanted to know what was out there. I felt this strange compulsion to follow the noise. I grabbed a flashlight and started toward the woods. "Frank, what are you doing?" Sam called after me. "I just want to check it out. I'll be back," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I walked toward the noise, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The rustling grew louder, and I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck, but I kept going. I don't know how far I walked, maybe a quarter mile, when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the flashlight's reach. It was tall, hunched over, with long arms that almost touched the ground. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew it was watching me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I stood there, locked in a silent standoff with this thing. Then it moved, a slow, deliberate step toward me. I took a step back, my flashlight shaking. The figure stopped, then took another step. I turned and ran, not looking back. I burst out of the woods, breathless and terrified. Sam was waiting by the fire, his eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" he asked. But I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, trying to catch my breath. We decided to leave first thing in the morning. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to be around to find out. We packed up quickly, the unease growing with each passing minute. As we were about to get in the RV, we heard it again, the rustling. But this time, it was all around us. I looked around, trying to see where it was coming from, but there was nothing. We jumped in the RV and started the engine. As we pulled away, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. I didn't say anything to Sam, just kept driving. We didn't talk much on the drive back. The silence was heavy, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we finally got home, we went our separate ways, promising to stay in touch but knowing things would never be the same. A few days later, I got a call from Sam's wife. She was frantic, saying Sam had gone missing. He'd gone out to the store and never came back. The police found his car abandoned on a back road, not far from where we had camped. They never found Sam. I still think about that trip, about what we saw out there. I don't know what it was, but I do know one thing. It's still out there in those woods, waiting. And I'll never go back. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the rustling again. I look out the window, half expecting to see that figure standing there, watching. But there's nothing. Just the empty night and the memories of a trip that changed everything. Folks around here call it the Watcher. I don't know what it is, but I know it's real. And I know it's dangerous. So if you're ever out in the Ozarks, be careful. You never know what's watching you from the shadows. I came to Red River Gorge to find peace, or at least that's what I told myself. When you've lost everything, when your life's fallen apart, nature feels like the only refuge. The solitude, the silence, they're supposed to help you clear your mind, right? But if I'd known what waited for me in those woods, I might have stayed home. I parked my old Jeep at the trailhead, strapped on my pack, and set off. The first day was perfect. The crisp autumn air had the faint smell of wet leaves, and the colors, God, the colors were dazzling. I'm a photographer by trade now, trying to make a name for myself since leaving teaching. The leaves, in their fiery oranges and deep reds, made the perfect backdrop for my shots. It was the kind of beauty you could get lost in. I guess that's what I was hoping for. The trail was tough though, harder than I expected. The steep climbs had my legs burning, and my pack felt heavier with every step. I could feel the camera bouncing against my back, reminding me why I was here. The plan was simple: a week alone in the wilderness. Just me, my gear, and enough food to get by. No distractions, no people, no Rachel. I shook the thought out of my head and kept walking, focusing on the landscape instead. The river was nearby, its faint gurgle a constant soundtrack to the crunch of leaves underfoot. By the time the sun started to dip, I was more exhausted than I should have been. My muscles ached from the unfamiliar terrain, and blisters had already formed on my heels. I set up camp by the river. I'd brought an old tent that had seen better days, but I figured it would hold up fine for a week. The stove, a clearance sale special, was already giving me trouble. The flame flickered weakly, as if unsure of itself, and I ended up eating half-cooked noodles before giving up and settling into my sleeping bag. That first night, I didn't sleep well. At first, it was just the usual branches rustling, the wind whispering through the leaves, but around midnight, I heard something strange. It sounded like a voice, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the trees. I sat up, listening. It came again, too soft to make out words, but there was a rhythm to it, a cadence like speech. My heart began to pound. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe distant campers, but there had been no cars at the trailhead. I was alone out here. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day was harder. The trail was steep and my legs were sore from the day before. The scenery was still breathtaking, but the deeper I went into the gorge, the more oppressive it felt. The trees grew closer together, their branches blocking out the sun, casting long shadows that made the woods seem darker than they should have been. It was around midday when I first saw it. I was setting up a shot of a rocky outcrop, the kind of thing that might make a good feature for my portfolio, when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. It was that primal sensation, the one that tells you you're not alone. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, and there it was. Just within the tree line, maybe 30 feet away. At first, I thought it was a person, someone tall and thin, wearing a long, tattered coat, but something was off. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, it just stood there, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. "You're just seeing things," I muttered to myself. "It's nothing." But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, clearer. I could almost make out words, but they were garbled like someone trying to speak underwater. I lay in my tent, wide-eyed and tense, listening. The sound wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to swirl around the camp, circling me. I grabbed my flashlight, zipped open the tent, and shined the beam into the woods. There was nothing, just the trees, the river, the empty night. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. I wanted to call out, but my throat was dry, my mouth frozen. I was too scared to make a sound, as if acknowledging it would make it real. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent fully and stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap. My breath came in sharp, visible puffs as I scanned the darkness. Then I saw the footprints. They were large, human-shaped and fresh, pressed into the damp earth around my tent. They hadn't been there before I went to bed. My heart raced as I knelt down to examine them. They circled my campsite as though someone or something had been watching me, walking around while I slept. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I backed away slowly, stumbling as I scrambled back into the tent and zipped it up as fast as I could. I huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The whispers continued, relentless, until dawn. By the third day, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept, and every step felt like agony. My legs were leaden, my pack seemed twice as heavy, and my mind was unraveling. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart into overdrive. I wanted to leave, but I was too far in now. It would take me days to hike back out, and the thought of turning around filled me with a strange sense of dread. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like the gorge itself didn't want me to leave, like it was holding me here, drawing me deeper into its clutches. I kept walking, pushing through the exhaustion, trying to ignore the whispers that still echoed in my head. By midday, I found myself near the river again at a small clearing. I decided to stop and rest, hoping the sight of the water might calm me. But as I sat there, staring at the rippling current, I saw something across the riverbank. The figure. It was standing on the opposite shore, half hidden by the trees. I could see it more clearly now, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long for its body. It wore tattered grayish rags that fluttered in the breeze. But its face was a blur, a smudge of darkness that seemed to shift and warp as I stared at it. My pulse quickened, and my breath caught in my throat. I fumbled for my camera, desperate to capture proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I raised the lens, focused on the figure, and snapped the shutter. The moment I did, the figure flickered like static on an old TV. 1 second it was there, and the next, it wasn't. Gone. I lowered the camera, my hands trembling. My gut told me to leave, to get the hell out of here, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by fear. The whispers returned, louder now, almost angry. They filled the air around me, a cacophony of voices speaking over each other, too fast to understand, and then I felt it. A cold, sharp pressure on my shoulder, like fingers pressing into my skin. I screamed, scrambling to my feet and backing away from the riverbank. The coldness followed me, clinging to me like invisible hands, trying to pull me down. I ran blindly, recklessly, away from the water, away from the voices. I didn't stop until I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. The whispers had faded, but the cold lingered, sinking deep into my bones. I was shaking, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I just experienced. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat by my dying campfire, clutching my camera, my eyes darting nervously around the darkened woods. The whispers had returned, but they were softer now, distant. I knew I wasn't alone. The figure, the wraith as I'd come to call it, was out there, watching me, waiting for me. I tried to rationalize it, but there was no denying the truth anymore. This wasn't just my imagination. This wasn't a trick of the light or the wind playing games with my mind. There was something in these woods, something ancient, something angry. On the 5th day, I decided to leave. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking with nervous energy. I didn't care how long it took. I had to get out of this place. But the gorge had other plans. As I made my way back toward the trailhead, the path seemed to shift beneath my feet. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find the way out. Every turn brought me back to the same spot, the same trees, the same stretch of river. It was like the forest was folding in on itself, trapping me in a maze of endless woods. And then I saw it again, the wraith. It stood in the distance, half hidden by the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I raised my camera again, my only weapon, and snapped the shutter. The wraith flickered, its form distorting, but it didn't disappear. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its tattered clothes trailing behind it like smoke. The whispers grew louder, the air around me colder, thicker. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest. The wraith didn't stop. It came closer and closer until it stood just feet away from me. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. Its face, a swirling mass of darkness, hovered inches from mine. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it spoke, "You can't leave." When I woke up, I was lying on the riverbank, soaked to the bone. The wraith was gone, but the memory of its voice lingered in my mind, an echo that refused to fade. I don't know how I made it back to the trailhead. I don't remember the walk, the drive, or even packing up my gear. But I know one thing for certain, I'll never go back to Red River Gorge. Some places weren't meant to be explored. My name is Samuel Ford, and in 2002, I found myself deep in the uninviting wilderness of Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska. Being stationed in the country's largest national park might sound impressive, but I can tell you right now there's nothing glamorous about days spent combing dense forests and jagged, ice-covered slopes in search of people who usually didn't want to be found. But I've got a soft spot for the park. I've been working here for a solid 8 years, and most of the time I wouldn't trade it for anything. Until I got a call from dispatch about an odd case, one that had already rattled the quiet community in McCarthy. 2 hikers, a couple by the name of Jody and Mark O'Connor, had gone missing after setting out for a backcountry trek. They were experienced hikers, the type who meticulously planned every trip, left detailed itineraries, and always checked in on schedule. But this time, they hadn't shown up, and their families were starting to get frantic. Normally, I'd write it off as bad luck or poor planning. People tend to underestimate how quickly this wilderness can turn on you. But there was a catch. They hadn't gone alone. They'd been in the company of a local guide, Sawyer Morgan, who was known to everyone in McCarthy. A rough guy, sure, with a dark sense of humor and a reputation for being a bit reckless, but he knew the land better than most. So when the 3 of them failed to return, and no one had heard a whisper from them for 3 days, it struck a nerve in the tight-knit community. I set out early the next morning, feeling a little more apprehensive than usual. The air was bitter cold, slicing right through the layers I'd bundled up in. My partner for the day was Mike Hargrave, a grizzled vet of the Park Service with a knack for telling off-colored jokes at the worst possible times. He met me at the trailhead, cracking a grin that told me he was in a better mood than I was. "Samuel," he said, "do you ever get the feeling some folks are just begging for trouble? Look at this." He pointed at the tracks leading into the trees, barely visible beneath a fresh dusting of snow. "Now, that ain't normal. You ever known Sawyer to get himself lost?" "No," I replied, trying to shake off the sense of foreboding creeping up on me. I hadn't. Sawyer was a bit of a hotshot, but the man knew his way around this place like it was his own backyard. Something didn't sit right, and as we trudged deeper into the forest, the feeling grew stronger. The trees loomed over us, skeletal and silent, a dense wall of dark green and white that seemed to close in tighter with every step. It was mid-afternoon when we stumbled across the first sign that something was wrong. A scattering of gear. Just a water bottle and a torn backpack strap lay half buried in the snow. Mike picked up the bottle, turning it over in his hands. "Looks like Mark's," he said quietly, then with his trademark humor creeping in, "probably a case of a nasty breakup. Nothing like a snowstorm to bring out a couple's issues." I didn't laugh. There was a sharpness to the air, something I couldn't quite place. The snow was falling harder now, making it difficult to see too far ahead. Mike and I pressed on, calling their names, hoping for any kind of response, but the forest swallowed every sound, and the quiet started to feel unnatural. We kept walking until dusk, a steady plodding rhythm that numbed our limbs and frayed our nerves. Just as I was beginning to think we'd have to turn back for the night, I spotted something through the trees. A dark shape, hulking and motionless against the snow, barely discernible in the twilight. At first, I thought it was a downed tree, but as we approached, the smell hit me, iron sharp and sickening. And then I saw it. The body of Sawyer Morgan, slumped and frozen, his skin a pale bluish hue against the snow. His jacket was shredded, hanging in tatters around his body and his throat. It looked as though something had torn it open with a single swipe. Mike swore under his breath, taking a step back. "Holy hell," he muttered. "That's not an accident." We circled the scene, examining the snow for tracks, trying to piece together what had happened, but the snow was disturbed, a mess of half-covered footprints and what looked like claw marks gouged into the ground. I'd seen my share of animal attacks, but this was something else. No bear or wolf could do this with such precision, and there wasn't a trace of blood anywhere except on the body. We marked the location and radioed in, telling dispatch we'd found one of the 3 missing hikers. But the response was static, broken up by the worsening storm. It was already getting dark, and with the temperature dropping fast, we knew we didn't have long before the cold would start taking its toll. Just then we heard it. A faint sound, like something scraping against a tree, somewhere close by. Both of us froze, straining our ears, but the noise had stopped as quickly as it had started. Mike whispered, "Alice, tell me you heard that." I nodded, gripping my flashlight a little tighter. The darkness around us seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. We moved slowly, inching forward when another sound broke the silence. It was closer this time, almost right beside us. A crunch, as if something heavy was moving through the snow, slowly, deliberately. I raised my flashlight, casting the beam over the trees. For a moment I thought I saw something, a massive shape standing just beyond the edge of the light, watching. I couldn't make out any details, just the bulk of it. Like a bear, but wrong. It was hunched, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and there was an unsettling intelligence in the way it moved. Then it lunged toward us. Mike yelled, stumbling back as I aimed my light at the thing, catching a glimpse of claws that looked almost human, elongated fingers tipped with ragged nails. It made a sound, a deep, wet rasp, like it was struggling to breathe, and that was enough to send both of us running. We sprinted through the trees, stumbling over roots and rocks, the sound of its pursuit thundering behind us. I didn't dare look back, too focused on staying ahead of whatever that thing was. I could hear Mike gasping, his footsteps pounding beside mine, and I prayed we'd make it to the trail before it closed the distance. But then, just as we broke through a clearing, I heard him cry out. I turned in time to see him go down, his body dragged back into the shadows as his flashlight flickered and died. His scream was cut short, leaving nothing but silence. I didn't stop. I couldn't. It was survival at that point, pure and simple. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. When I finally dared to stop, I realized I had no idea where I was. The snow was falling in thick sheets now, covering my tracks and leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. The silence was oppressive, the forest unnaturally still. I crouched down, catching my breath, my mind racing as I tried to figure out my next move. That's when I heard it again, that scraping sound, soft and deliberate, coming from somewhere close. I ducked behind a tree, my heart pounding as I fumbled for my radio. I whispered into it, hoping for some miracle that it would pick up a signal, but all I got was static. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The creature stood at the edge of the trees, its head tilted as if studying me. Now that I could see it more clearly, I felt a wave of nausea. It had the body of a predator, lean and muscular, but its skin was stretched too tightly over its bones, giving it a twisted, almost human look. Its mouth was too wide, filled with rows of teeth that looked like they belonged to a shark, and those hands, long, bony fingers that flexed and curled as it watched me. I took a step back, my mind racing through my options, which weren't many. I didn't have a weapon, not even a pocket knife. Running seemed like a death sentence, but staying put wasn't much better. The creature took a step forward, its gaze fixed on me, and I knew I had to make a choice. In a desperate move, I turned and bolted, weaving between the trees, trying to lose it in the dense forest. The thing let out a guttural hiss, and I heard it crashing through the underbrush behind me. My legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last, but I pushed forward, ignoring the burning in my lungs. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled out of the forest and into a clearing, my chest heaving as I collapsed onto the ground. The storm had worsened, the snow blinding, and I realized I'd somehow circled back to where we'd found Sawyer's body. Except now, there were two bodies. Mike lay sprawled in the snow, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his face frozen in a look of sheer terror. I staggered to my feet, my mind reeling. The thing had dragged him back here, left him as a warning, or maybe just for sport. I didn't want to stick around to find out which. I turned and stumbled through the snow, the cold seeping into my bones, numbing my fingers and toes. I kept moving, driven by pure instinct, not daring to look back. I could still feel it, somewhere in the darkness following me, relentless and patient, its presence like a shadow pressing in around me. When I finally made it back to the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I collapsed onto the ground, the snow biting into my skin, but I didn't care. I was alive, and that was enough. Night RV camping just outside the Sierra Nevada mountains, not too far from Mono Lake. Now, I wouldn't call myself an outdoorsman by any stretch of the imagination. Honestly, I was more of a stay inside, sip on something warm kind of guy. But a divorce and a midlife crisis will drive you to some weird places. After a decade of city noise, I figured a solo RV trip into the mountains might clear my head. Turns out that kind of peace and quiet isn't always as comforting as you'd think. I'd parked my RV at one of those smaller, secluded campsites where you're more likely to find deer than people, which was kind of the point. The first couple of nights were uneventful, just me, a few beers, and some bad attempts at cooking over a campfire. I'd been telling myself it was the perfect kind of escape, though I'll admit that by night 3, the isolation had started to feel a little less peaceful and more claustrophobic. But what was I going to do? Pack up and head back to the city? Nah, that would have felt like losing. Plus, I was still trying to get used to sleeping in an RV without the constant hum of city life around me. Everything out there was too still. Every tiny crack in the forest made my skin crawl. But hey, what's a little discomfort compared to proving to myself I wasn't totally losing my edge at 42? That night, as I was lying on the RV bed, scrolling through some half-downloaded articles on my phone, I noticed the light outside flicker. Not a campfire glow, something sharper, more precise. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, maybe a reflection of something metallic in the distance. But it happened again, this time closer. I sat up, listening. I wasn't one of those paranoid types, but when you're out alone in the mountains, your mind has a way of turning normal things into, well, not so normal things. For a while, nothing happened. The wind rustled the leaves, an owl hooted off in the distance, the kind of noises you should expect in the middle of nowhere. Then, just as I was about to let it go and settle back into my semi-uncomfortable RV bed, there was a sound. Not the wind, not some critter scurrying about. This was the distinct crunch of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the trees just beyond my RV. There were no major spelling errors, but I made a few minor punctuation and clarity tweaks for smoothness. I grabbed my flashlight, hesitating before I opened the RV door. There wasn't much else I could do. I didn't own a gun, never really saw the need in the city, and honestly, I'd thought the RV would provide enough protection from whatever the woods had to offer. You know, deer, maybe a curious bear or something, not a strange man lurking outside. The moment I stepped outside, the figure bolted fast. I shined my flashlight in the direction they ran, catching a glimpse of a dirty face, long stringy hair, and something like a wild grin flashing in the dark. But before I could process it, they were gone, disappearing into the thick trees. I wanted to believe that was the end of it, that maybe it was just some vagrant who didn't want trouble, but when I got back inside, something had changed. The flashlight beam caught a reflection on the passenger seat of my RV. My heart sank when I saw it. A large hunting knife jammed into the seat. It wasn't mine. Now I know what you're thinking. How could I have missed someone sneaking into my RV? I couldn't tell you. Maybe I had dozed off earlier, or maybe this guy was just good at what he did. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I wasn't alone, and whoever this guy was, he had keys. I fumbled for my phone, planning to call the Rangers, but of course, out here, there was no signal. So, like any rational person, I locked every door and window, grabbed the closest thing to a weapon I had, a camping hatchet, and sat in the driver's seat, keeping an eye on the tree line. I wasn't planning on staying the night anymore. First light, I was getting the hell out of there, but first light didn't come fast enough. I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion overriding my adrenaline, because the next thing I knew, it was around 2 a.m. and the entire RV shook. It wasn't a tree falling or some kind of animal bumping into it. It was deliberate, like someone was trying to force their way in. I jumped up, clutching the hatchet, and shouted out, hoping to scare them off, but the pounding didn't stop. When the door finally flew open, it wasn't subtle. The figure from earlier barreled in, wild and grinning, holding a crowbar. There was no conversation, no demands. He lunged at me. I also made small adjustments for flow and clarity where it felt natural. I won't bore you with the gory details, but let's just say it wasn't one of those quick, clean self-defense moments you see in the movies. I got some good hits in, but not before he bashed me pretty good with the crowbar. Blood was everywhere. His, mine. It all blended together in the chaos. At some point, we both fell out of the RV and the fight spilled onto the ground. I don't know how, but I got the upper hand, slamming the hatchet down into his chest. The fight stopped then, just like that. I remember standing over him, gasping for air, not really registering what had happened until I saw the light dimming in his wild eyes. He was gone. I staggered back into the RV, dazed, bloody, and in shock. I locked myself inside, not knowing what else to do. Calling for help wasn't an option out here, so I waited. Just me, the dead guy outside in the silence of the forest. By the time morning rolled around, I was still wide awake, eyes fixed on the body outside. I don't know why I hadn't moved it. Maybe I just needed the daylight to confirm it wasn't some sick nightmare. Eventually, I stepped out, the crisp mountain air biting at my face. I searched the man's pockets, half expecting to find nothing, but there it was. His wallet. His name was Warren Gibson. He was wanted in 3 states for murder, and here I was, alone with his body, no cell service, and a whole mess of questions I didn't have the answers to. The cops eventually found me that afternoon after a couple of hikers came across my bloodied RV and freaked out. They took one look at me, the body, and started asking the usual questions. I don't even remember half of what I told them, just that it was self-defense, which, to be fair, was the truth. Turns out Warren had been squatting in the mountains for years, preying on isolated campers. They'd been looking for him for a long time. Funny thing is, I'd planned this trip to escape the chaos of the city, to find some peace and quiet. My name is Michael Lopez. I'm 31 years old, and up until last week, I prided myself on being fearless. I've explored abandoned hospitals, trekked through deserts, and even camped alone in bear country. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened at Goose Lake. I still don't know if I'm lucky to have escaped or cursed because I went there in the first place. It all started with a tip from one of my subscribers. I'm a travel blogger, and my channel focuses on exploring offbeat places, especially ones with creepy or mysterious reputations. A viewer messaged me about Goose Lake, a small body of water tucked away near Clinton, Iowa, and its supposed haunting by the drowned maiden. According to local legend, a woman named Mary Abbott drowned there in the late 1800s under suspicious circumstances. Some say she was killed by a jealous lover, others claim she lures people to their deaths. It sounded perfect for my next video. I arrived at Goose Lake on a chilly October afternoon. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the water, still and dark, mirrored the overcast sky. The place was eerily beautiful, exactly the kind of location my audience loved. The first person I met was a fisherman named Nathan. He was pulling his boat up onto the shore as I parked my RV. "You camping here?" he asked, squinting at me like I just told him I planned to swim with sharks. "Yeah, just for the night," I said, grabbing my camera gear. "I heard there's some cool history here." Nathan snorted. "History, sure, but not the kind you want to mess with." He told me about Mary Abbott's ghost, how people claim to hear her crying or calling their names at night. "If you're smart, you'll leave before sunset," he added, shaking his head. I laughed it off. I've heard plenty of spooky stories over the years, and none of them ever scared me off. Besides, I had a video to make. Let me know if you'd like it formatted differently, turned into a script, or continued. Though it was already very clean, only a couple of minor tweaks were needed, mostly stylistic consistency. I spent the afternoon exploring the lake's edge, filming the dense woods and the water's inky surface. It was peaceful enough, at least at first, but as I was flying my drone over the lake, it suddenly veered off course and crashed into the water. "Damn it," I muttered, wading in to retrieve it. The water was icy cold, and as I pulled the drone out, I glanced down at the surface. That's when I saw it, a fleeting reflection of a pale, distorted face staring up at me. I froze, my heart pounding, but when I looked again, the reflection was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was primed to see something spooky, wasn't I? Back in the RV, I checked the footage from the drone. Most of it was fine until the last few seconds. That's where the camera captured a faint figure standing at the edge of the lake. It was too far away to make out details, but it sent a chill down my spine. As darkness fell, the lake took on an oppressive silence. No frogs croaking, no crickets chirping, just the sound of my own breathing. I cooked a quick dinner on the tiny RV stove, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft knock on the RV door. My stomach twisted. Who could be out here at this hour? I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door. No one was there. I stepped outside, scanning the area. The beam of my flashlight caught something on the ground. Wet footprints leading from the water to my RV. They were small, like a child's, and they ended abruptly at the door. A shiver ran down my spine and I bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. By morning, the eerie events felt almost— "It's not a ghost," Laura said sharply. "It's a spirit, a creature. The Wendigo appears when something's wrong, when the land's been disrespected or people have gone too far. It preys on greed and hunger." I laughed, trying to ease the tension. "Well, good thing we're not greedy." Laura didn't laugh. She looked at me, then at Chris. "Be careful. Things can change quickly out here." Her warning lingered as we hiked deeper into the forest. Chris was unusually quiet, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. I tried to shake off my unease, focusing on setting up new motion sensor cameras. But as I reviewed the footage, the images disturbed me. The cameras had captured blurry shapes, elongated, humanoid figures skirting the edges of the frame. I didn't tell Chris, he was already on edge. That night, the forest came alive with sounds, faint growls, snapping twigs, and something that sounded like breathing. I stayed by the fire, gripping my flashlight while Chris sat rigid beside me. "I heard it," he whispered. "Tell me you heard it." "I heard it," I admitted. "Stay close." At some point, Chris stood abruptly. "I'm going to the RV." "No way," I said. "It's too far," but he was already walking into the darkness. I chased after him, my flashlight barely piercing the gloom. "Chris, stop!" He turned, his face pale. "Didn't you hear her? Laura's voice. She's calling for help." I stared at him. "Chris, Laura's not here." But he wasn't listening. He kept moving faster now until I grabbed his arm and yanked him back. "Listen to me!" I shouted. "You're not thinking clearly." Chris looked at me confused, as if waking from a dream. I thought I heard." The growling returned, closer this time. The foul stench of decay filled the air, making my stomach churn. Something moved in the shadows, too fast to see. "Run," I whispered. We sprinted back to camp, but the fire had died. The woods pressed in around us, suffocating and silent. Then came the mimicry. "Chris," a voice called, identical to mine. He froze, staring into the trees. "Evan? What?" "It's not me," I hissed. "Don't listen to it." The voice came again, closer. "Chris, help me." Chris grabbed my arm, his face white with fear. "What is that?" The answer came with the snap of branches. A figure stepped into the clearing. A gaunt, elongated humanoid with glowing eyes and claws that gleamed in the faint moonlight. The smell of rot was overwhelming. It was the Wendigo. I shoved Chris toward the trail. "Run! Don't stop!" The Wendigo moved with unnatural speed, circling us. Its glowing eyes locked on Chris. It growled, a guttural, bone-chilling sound. Chris tripped, falling hard, and I turned back, swinging my flashlight wildly. The light caught the creature's face, twisted and skeletal, its lips curling back to reveal jagged teeth. It flinched, momentarily blinded, and I used the distraction to drag Chris to his feet. We stumbled through the forest, the Wendigo's footsteps echoing behind us. I didn't know where we were going. I just knew we had to keep moving. We found Laura at the edge of the forest. She had a torch in one hand and a look of grim determination on her face. "It's here, isn't it?" she said. I nodded, gasping for breath. "What do we do?" "Fire," she said. "It's the only thing that weakens it." Chris was shaking, his face pale. "We're going to die out here." "No, we're not," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "We fight." Laura handed me a torch, lighting it with hers. The Wendigo emerged moments later, its movements jerky and unnatural. It circled us, growling, its eyes gleaming with hunger. "Hold your ground," Laura said. "Don't let it separate us." The creature lunged. Faster than I could react, Laura swung her torch. The flames grazed its side and it screeched, recoiling. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard. Chris panicked, dropping his torch and bolting into the woods. "Chris, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. The Wendigo turned, chasing after him. Stay here, I told Laura, running after my friend. I found Chris slumped against a tree, his breathing shallow. The Wendigo stood over him, its claws poised. I didn't think. I just acted, swinging my torch with all my strength. The flames caught its arm, and it howled, retreating into the shadows. Chris looked up at me, his eyes glassy. Evan, he whispered. It's inside my head. I can't stop it. You're fine, I said, pulling him to his feet. We're getting out of here. We made it back to Laura, but Chris wasn't the same. He muttered incoherently, his eyes darting around like he was seeing things I couldn't. We have to go, Laura said. Now. The three of us ran, the Wendigo's growls following us all the way to the RV. When we finally reached it, I shoved Chris inside and slammed the door. Laura and I collapsed, exhausted, but something felt wrong. Chris was silent, sitting in the corner, his head bowed. I approached cautiously. Chris, I said. He looked up, smiling, a cold, unnatural smile. You can't escape, he said, his voice distorted. The Wendigo's reflection gleamed in his eyes. We drove away, leaving the gorge behind, but the claw marks on the RV side were a stark reminder of what we'd faced. Chris didn't speak again. His smile was frozen, his eyes distant. As we crossed the state line, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The Wendigo stood at the edge of the forest, watching us. We survived, but I'll never go back. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. And flow while keeping your original tone and structure intact. I'd been driving for hours, the narrow desert highway stretching endlessly in front of me. The sun was a golden orb sinking behind the mesas, painting the sky in fiery hues. My RV rattled as the pavement turned to dirt, the road leading me deeper into the vast, silent expanse of Canyon Hollow. This was where I wanted to be, alone, surrounded by nothing but red rock and the occasional shriek of a hawk. I needed to clear my head, to find some kind of peace, or at least a distraction. 6 months had passed since the accident, but the guilt was as raw as ever. I should have been more careful. I couldn't escape that thought, no matter how far I drove. Canyon Hollow was famous for its petroglyphs, remnants of an ancient people whose art told stories of life, death, and something in between. It was also infamous for its mysteries, tales of settlers who vanished, of travelers who never made it out. But I didn't believe in that sort of thing. History was history, nothing more. I pulled into the campground as dusk settled, parking near the edge of the canyon. There were only 2 other campers, an older couple in a beat-up RV several spots down. They waved as I stepped out, and I gave them a nod. The silence of the desert was almost unnerving, the kind of quiet that pressed on your ears. I shook it off and set up camp, promising myself a good night's rest before exploring the next day. That first night, I dreamed of the accident. I was back on the ridge, the rocks crumbling beneath my feet. I heard Alex shouting, his voice raw with panic. My hands reached out for him, but I wasn't fast enough. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the RV as it settled into the cool desert air. I stepped outside for some fresh air. The moon hung high, casting long shadows over the red rocks. I could see the older couple's RV, their lights off. Beyond them, the canyon stretched out, an ocean of darkness. That's when I heard it, a faint voice carried on the wind. Ethan. I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was Alex's. Impossible, I told myself. Just a trick of the wind. I stood there for a moment, staring into the void before retreating to the safety of the RV. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. The sun was bright, and the desert looked almost friendly in the daylight. I packed a bag with water and snacks and set off to explore the petroglyphs. The trail was rugged, winding through narrow canyons and open plains dotted with junipers. The carvings appeared in clusters, etched into the stone with astonishing precision. Animals, spirals, figures locked in what looked like dances or battles. Then I found the symbol. When I got back to camp, the older couple's RV was gone. At first, I thought they'd left while I was out, but their spot was wrong. Their folding chairs were still there, along with a cooler and a half-empty coffee mug. Their fire pit had ashes that were still warm. I walked over, calling out, but no one answered. The RV keys were sitting on the folding table as if they'd just stepped away for a moment. A heavy unease settled over me, but I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe they'd gone for a hike. Maybe they'd gotten a ride into town. But as night fell, the unease turned into something closer to fear. The wind picked up after sundown, howling through the canyon like a living thing. I sat inside the RV, trying to focus on anything but the emptiness outside. That's when I noticed the journal. It was sitting on my passenger seat, leather-bound and worn. I hadn't seen it there before. My pulse quickened as I flipped it open. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the entries chronicling the travels of someone who had camped here before me. At first, the notes were mundane, descriptions of the canyon, complaints about the heat, but as the entries went on, they grew darker. Something is out there. I see shadows at night, faces in the mirrors. I thought I was alone, but I'm not. They're watching me. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. Don't let them in. No matter what you hear, don't let them in. I snapped the journal shut, my hands trembling. The RV groaned as the wind buffeted it, and for a moment I thought I heard a knock at the door. Just the wind, I told myself. But then it came again, louder. Hello? I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The desert stretched out before me, empty and silent. But then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the ridge down to my RV. My stomach turned. That night, I barricaded the door with everything I could find. Sleep was out of the question. The whispers started around midnight, faint at first, then louder. They called my name, voices I recognized but couldn't place. Alex was one of them. I covered my ears, rocking back and forth until the sun came up. Let me know if you'd like help formatting this into a short story or adding to it. Relief flooding me when it roared to life. But as I drove toward the exit, the road twisted and looped, always bringing me back to the campground. I tried every direction, but it was no use. It was like the canyon wouldn't let me go. Desperation drove me back to the petroglyphs. I followed the spirals, hoping they held some kind of answer. The silence was crushing now, the air heavy with dread. And then I saw it, a wagon train, fully intact, crossing the canyon in the distance. At first, I thought it was a mirage, but as I got closer, the figures became clearer. Men, women, and children in 19th century clothing. Their faces were pale, their movements slow and deliberate. I shouted, waving my arms, but they didn't react. As I approached, they vanished, leaving only skeletal remains of wagons and rusted tools in their wake. That night, they came for me. I sat in the RV, knife in hand, as shadows moved outside. The voices were louder now, pleading and accusing all at once. Why did you leave me, Ethan? Alex's voice cut through the din, filled with anger and sorrow. The windows fogged as hollow faces pressed against the glass, their empty eye sockets weeping black tears. They began to bang on the walls, the door shaking on its hinges. You can't hide, they whispered. You belong here with us. I thought of the journal, of its warning not to let them in. But the voices grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with guilt and regret. I clutched the knife, my knuckles white. Then I remembered the spirals. The petroglyphs had to mean something. A way out, a key. I grabbed Alex's compass, the only keepsake I had of him, and bolted from the RV. The shadows followed, their whispers echoing through the canyon. I reached the spirals and fell to my knees, holding the compass above the carvings. I'm sorry, I said, tears streaming down my face. I'm so sorry, Alex. The air grew still. The shadows stopped moving. One by one, they dissolved into the canyon mist, their voices fading into silence. The compass grew warm in my hand before falling still. My name's James Harris. It was 2008, and I was on my third night RV camping just outside the Sierra Nevada mountains, not too far from Mono Lake. Now, I wouldn't call myself an outdoorsman by any stretch of the imagination. Honestly, I was more of a stay inside, sip on something warm kind of guy. But a divorce and a midlife crisis will drive you to some weird places. After a decade of city noise, I figured a solo RV trip into the mountains might clear my head. Turns out that kind of peace and quiet isn't always as comforting as you'd think. I'd parked my RV at one of those smaller, secluded campsites where you're more likely to find deer than people, which was kind of the point. The first couple of nights were uneventful, just me, a few beers, and some bad attempts at cooking over a campfire. I'd been telling myself it was the perfect kind of escape, Though I'll admit that by night 3, the isolation had started to feel a little less peaceful and more claustrophobic. But what was I going to do? Pack up and head back to the city? Nah, that would have felt like losing. Plus, I was still trying to get used to sleeping in an RV without the constant hum of city life around me. Everything out there was too still. Every tiny crack in the forest made my skin crawl. But hey, what's a little discomfort compared to proving to myself I wasn't totally losing my edge at 42? That night, as I was lying on the RV bed, scrolling through some half-downloaded articles on my phone, I noticed the light outside flicker. Not a campfire glow, something sharper, more precise. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, maybe a reflection of something metallic in the distance. But it happened again, this time closer. I sat up, listening. I wasn't one of those paranoid types, but when you're out alone in the mountains, your mind has a way of turning normal things into, well, not so normal things. For a while, nothing happened. The wind rustled the leaves, an owl hooted off in the distance, the kind of noises you should expect in the middle of nowhere. Then, just as I was about to let it go and settle back into my semi-uncomfortable RV bed, there was a sound. Not the wind, not some critter scurrying about. This was the distinct crunch of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the trees just beyond my RV. I slid out of bed and peered out the tiny RV window. At first, I didn't see anything, just the pitch-black woods and the faint silhouette of my truck parked beside the RV. But then there it was, a figure standing still, halfway between the trees and my vehicle. At first, I figured it was just another camper who'd wandered over to the wrong site, but then I realized there wasn't supposed to be anyone else this far out. I didn't even hear the sound of another RV or car coming in earlier. I squinted, trying to make out more details. The figure stood there frozen, almost like it was waiting for something. They were tall, lanky, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie, but something felt off. My gut was telling me this wasn't just some lost hiker, and you don't ignore gut feelings out here. I grabbed my flashlight, hesitating before I opened the RV door. There wasn't much else I could do. I didn't own a gun, never really saw the need in the city, and honestly, I'd thought the RV would provide enough protection from whatever the woods had to offer. You know, deer, maybe a curious bear or something, not a strange man lurking outside. The moment I stepped outside, the figure bolted fast. I shined my flashlight in the direction they ran, catching a glimpse of a dirty face, long stringy hair, and something like a wild grin flashing in the dark. But before I could process it, they were gone, disappearing into the thick trees. I wanted to believe that was the end of it, that maybe it was just some vagrant who didn't want trouble, but when I got back inside, something had changed. The flashlight beam caught a reflection on the passenger seat of my RV. My heart sank when I saw it. A large hunting knife jammed into the seat. It wasn't mine. Now I know what you're thinking. How could I have missed someone sneaking into my RV? I couldn't tell you. Maybe I had dozed off earlier, or maybe this guy was just good at what he did. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I wasn't alone, and whoever this guy was, he had keys. I fumbled for my phone, planning to call the Rangers, but of course, out here, there was no signal. So, like any rational person, I locked every door and window, grabbed the closest thing to a weapon I had, a camping hatchet, and sat in the driver's seat, keeping an eye on the tree line. I wasn't planning on staying the night anymore. First light, I was getting the hell out of there, but first light didn't come fast enough. I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion overriding my adrenaline, because the next thing I knew, it was around 2 a.m., and the entire RV shook. It wasn't a tree falling or some kind of animal bumping into it. It was deliberate, like someone was trying to force their way in. I jumped up, clutching the hatchet, and shouted out, hoping to scare them off, but the pounding didn't stop. When the door finally flew open, it wasn't subtle. The figure from earlier barreled in, wild and grinning, holding a crowbar. There was no conversation, no demands. He lunged at me immediately, swinging the crowbar, catching me off guard. I swung back with the hatchet, but missed. He was faster than I expected. I won't bore you with the gory details, but let's just say it wasn't one of those quick, clean self-defense moments you see in the movies. I got some good hits in, but not before he bashed me pretty good with the crowbar. Blood was everywhere. His, mine. It all blended together in the chaos. At some point, we both fell out of the RV and the fight spilled onto the ground. I don't know how, but I got the upper hand, slamming the hatchet down into his chest. The fight stopped then, just like that. I remember standing over him, gasping for air, not really registering what had happened until I saw the light dimming in his wild eyes. He was gone. I staggered back into the RV, dazed, bloody, and in shock. I locked myself inside, not knowing what else to do. Calling for help wasn't an option out here, so I waited. Just me, the dead guy outside in the silence of the forest. By the time morning rolled around, I was still wide awake, eyes fixed on the body outside. I don't know why I hadn't moved it. Maybe I just needed the daylight to confirm it wasn't some sick nightmare. Eventually, I stepped out, the crisp mountain air biting at my face. I searched the man's pockets, half expecting to find nothing, but there it was. His wallet. His name was Warren Gibson. He was wanted in 3 states for murder, and here I was, alone with his body, no cell service, and a whole mess of questions I didn't have the answers to. The cops eventually found me that afternoon after a couple of hikers came across my bloodied RV and freaked out. They took one look at me, the body, and started asking the usual questions. I don't even remember half of what I told them, just that it was self-defense, which, to be fair, was the truth. Turns out Warren had been squatting in the mountains for years, preying on isolated campers. They'd been looking for him for a long time. Funny thing is, I'd planned this trip to escape the chaos of the city, to find some peace and quiet. I ended up right in the middle of someone else's nightmare. Still, all things considered, I guess I got off easy. My name is Michael Lopez. I'm 31 years old, and up until last week, I prided myself on being fearless. I've explored abandoned hospitals, trekked through deserts, and even camped alone in bear country. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened at Goose Lake. I still don't know if I'm lucky to have escaped or cursed because I went there in the first place. It all started with a tip from one of my subscribers. I'm a travel blogger, and my channel focuses on exploring offbeat places, especially ones with creepy or mysterious reputations. A viewer messaged me about Goose Lake, a small body of water tucked away near Clinton, Iowa, and its supposed haunting by the drowned maiden. According to local legend, a woman named Mary Abbott drowned there in the late 1800s under suspicious circumstances. Some say she was killed by a jealous lover, others claim she lures people to their deaths. It sounded perfect for my next video. I arrived at Goose Lake on a chilly October afternoon. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the water, still and dark, mirrored the overcast sky. The place was eerily beautiful, exactly the kind of location my audience loved. The first person I met was a fisherman named Nathan. He was pulling his boat up onto the shore as I parked my RV. "You camping here?" he asked, squinting at me like I just told him I planned to swim with sharks. "Yeah, just for the night," I said, grabbing my camera gear. "I heard there's some cool history here." Nathan snorted. "History, sure, but not the kind you want to mess with." He told me about Mary Abbott's ghost, how people claimed to hear her crying or calling their names at night. "If you're smart, you'll leave before sunset," he added, shaking his head. I laughed it off. I've heard plenty of spooky stories over the years, and none of them ever scared me off. Besides, I had a video to make. I spent the afternoon exploring the lake's edge, filming the dense woods and the water's inky surface. It was peaceful enough, at least at first, but as I was flying my drone over the lake, it suddenly veered off course and crashed into the water. "Damn it," I muttered, wading in to retrieve it. The water was icy cold, and as I pulled the drone out, I glanced down at the surface. That's when I saw it, a fleeting reflection of a pale, distorted face staring up at me. I froze, my heart pounding, but when I looked again, the reflection was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was primed to see something spooky, wasn't I? Back in the RV, I checked the footage from the drone. Most of it was fine until the last few seconds. That's where the camera captured a faint figure standing at the edge of the lake. It was too far away to make out details, but it sent a chill down my spine. As darkness fell, the lake took on an oppressive silence. No frogs croaking, no crickets chirping, just the sound of my own breathing. I cooked a quick dinner on the tiny RV stove, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I heard it, A soft knock on the RV door. My stomach twisted. Who could be out here at this hour? I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door. No one was there. I stepped outside, scanning the area. The beam of my flashlight caught something on the ground. Wet footprints leading from the water to my RV. They were small, like a child's, and they ended abruptly at the door. A shiver ran down my spine, and I bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. By morning, the eerie events felt almost like a dream. Determined to shake off the fear, I drove into town to meet Maggie O'Connor, a local historian who ran a shop filled with books, antiques, and trinkets. Maggie was delighted to talk about Goose Lake. Mary Abbott was a tragic figure, she said, her hands clasped over a steaming cup of tea. She was engaged to a wealthy man, but when he discovered she'd been unfaithful, he drowned her in the lake. Do you believe she haunts the place? I asked, half joking. Maggie's expression darkened. I do. Many people have seen her, heard her crying. Some say she tries to pull them into the water, as if she's still searching for her lover or her revenge. Before I left, Maggie handed me a small iron charm. For protection, she said, just in case. I returned to the lake feeling more uneasy than I wanted to admit. As night fell, the air grew heavy and an unnatural fog rolled in, obscuring the shoreline. Then the voices started. At first, they were faint, like whispers carried on the wind. But soon they grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but they were definitely calling my name. I stayed inside the RV, clutching the iron charm Maggie had given me. My camera sat on the table, still recording in case anything happened. Around 3 a.m., I saw her. She stood at the edge of the fog, her figure barely visible in the dim light of the moon. Her dress was tattered and dripping wet, her hair hanging in clumps around her pale face, and her hollow, empty eyes were fixed on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She raised a hand, beckoning me to come closer. The whispers grew deafening, filling the air with an otherworldly hum. I don't know what possessed me to go outside. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was her voice, soft and pleading, calling my name. As I stepped closer to the lake, the fog thickened, wrapping around me like a shroud. The water lapped at the shore, dark and inviting. Michael, she whispered, her voice a blend of sorrow and rage. She reached out to me, her cold, wet fingers brushing my arm. In that moment, I felt a wave of despair so overwhelming it nearly brought me to my knees. It was like drowning in grief. But then I remembered the charm. I gripped it tightly, its rough edges digging into my palm. The ghost recoiled, letting out a piercing scream that shattered the silence. I stumbled back, breaking free of the fog. I didn't stop running until I was in the driver's seat of my RV, tearing down the dirt road as fast as the vehicle could go. Later, when I reviewed the footage, I saw her again. Her face appearing in the reflections of the lake in the windows of my RV, even in the fog. She was always watching. I uploaded the video, and it went viral. People debated whether it was real or staged, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I would never, ever go back to Goose Lake. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear her voice calling my name. I'd been driving for hours, the narrow desert highway stretching endlessly in front of me. The sun was a golden orb sinking behind the mesas, painting the sky in fiery hues. My RV rattled as the pavement turned to dirt, the road leading me deeper into the vast, silent expanse of Canyon Hollow. This was where I wanted to be, alone, surrounded by nothing but red rock and the occasional shriek of a hawk. I needed to clear my head, to find some kind of peace, or at least a distraction. 6 months had passed since the accident, but the guilt was as raw as ever. I should have been more careful. I couldn't escape that thought, no matter how far I drove. Canyon Hollow was famous for its petroglyphs, remnants of an ancient people whose art told stories of life, death, and something in between. It was also infamous for its mysteries, tales of settlers who vanished, of travelers who never made it out. But I didn't believe in that sort of thing. History was history, nothing more. I pulled into the campground as dusk settled, parking near the edge of the canyon. There were only 2 other campers, an older couple in a beat-up RV several spots down. They waved as I stepped out, and I gave them a nod. The silence of the desert was almost unnerving, the kind of quiet that pressed on your ears. I shook it off and set up camp, promising myself a good night's rest before exploring the next day. That first night, I dreamed of the accident. I was back on the ridge, the rocks crumbling beneath my feet. I heard Alex shouting, his voice raw with panic. My hands reached out for him, but I wasn't fast enough. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the RV as it settled into the cool desert air. I stepped outside for some fresh air. The moon hung high, casting long shadows over the red rocks. I could see the older couple's RV, their lights off. Beyond them, the canyon stretched out, an ocean of darkness. That's when I heard it, a faint voice carried on the wind. Ethan. I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was Alex's. Impossible, I told myself. Just a trick of the wind. I stood there for a moment, staring into the void before retreating to the safety of the RV. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. The sun was bright, and the desert looked almost friendly in the daylight. I packed a bag with water and snacks and set off to explore the petroglyphs. The trail was rugged, winding through narrow canyons and open plains dotted with junipers. The carvings appeared in clusters, etched into the stone with astonishing precision. Animals, spirals, figures locked in what looked like dances or battles. Then I found the symbols. Unlike the other carvings, these were jagged and erratic, spirals that twisted into themselves like whirlpools. They didn't fit with the rest of the art. Standing there, I felt a chill despite the sun. It wasn't just the symbols, it was the silence. No birds, no wind, just me and the rocks. When I got back to camp, the older couple's RV was gone. At first, I thought they'd left while I was out, but their spot was wrong. Their folding chairs were still there, along with a cooler and a half-empty coffee mug. Their fire pit had ashes that were still warm. I walked over, calling out, but no one answered. The RV keys were sitting on the folding table as if they'd just stepped away for a moment. A heavy unease settled over me, but I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe they'd gone for a hike. Maybe they'd gotten a ride into town. But as night fell, the unease turned into something closer to fear. The wind picked up after sundown, howling through the canyon like a living thing. I sat inside the RV, trying to focus on anything but the emptiness outside. That's when I noticed the journal. It was sitting on my passenger seat, leather-bound and worn. I hadn't seen it there before. My pulse quickened as I flipped it open. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the entries chronicling the travels of someone who had camped here before me. At first, the notes were mundane, descriptions of the canyon, complaints about the heat, but as the entries went on, they grew darker. Something is out there. I see shadows at night, faces in the mirrors. I thought I was alone, but I'm not. They're watching me. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. Don't let them in. No matter what you hear, don't let them in. I snapped the journal shut, my hands trembling. The RV groaned as the wind buffeted it, and for a moment I thought I heard a knock at the door. Just the wind, I told myself. But then it came again, louder. Hello? I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The desert stretched out before me, empty and silent. But then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the ridge down to my RV. My stomach turned. That night, I barricaded the door with everything I could find. Sleep was out of the question. The whispers started around midnight, faint at first, then louder. They called my name, voices I recognized but couldn't place. Alex was one of them. I covered my ears, rocking back and forth until the sun came up. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed up as fast as I could and started the engine, relief flooding me when it roared to life. But as I drove toward the exit, the road twisted and looped, always bringing me back to the campground. I tried every direction, but it was no use. It was like the canyon wouldn't let me go. Desperation drove me back to the petroglyphs. I followed the spirals, hoping they held some kind of answer. The silence was crushing now, the air heavy with dread. And then I saw it, a wagon train, fully intact, crossing the canyon in the distance. At first, I thought it was a mirage, but as I got closer, the figures became clearer. Men, women, and children in 19th century clothing. Their faces were pale, their movements slow and deliberate. I shouted, waving my arms, but they didn't react. As I approached, they vanished, leaving only skeletal remains of wagons and rusted tools in their wake. That night, they came for me. I sat in the RV, knife in hand, as shadows moved outside. The voices were louder now, pleading and accusing all at once. "Why did you leave me, Ethan?" Alex's voice cut through the din, filled with anger and sorrow. The windows fogged as hollow faces pressed against the glass, their empty eye sockets weeping black tears. They began to bang on the walls, the door shaking on its hinges. "You can't hide," they whispered. "You belong here with us." I thought of the journal, of its warning not to let them in. But the voices grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with guilt and regret. I clutched the knife, my knuckles white. Then I remembered the spirals. The petroglyphs had to mean something. A way out, a key. I grabbed Alex's compass, the only keepsake I had of him, and bolted from the RV. The shadows followed, their whispers echoing through the canyon. I reached the spirals and fell to my knees, holding the compass above the carvings. "I'm sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry, Alex." The air grew still. The shadows stopped moving. One by one, they dissolved into the canyon mist, their voices fading into silence. The compass grew warm in my hand before falling still. The road was clear. The next morning, I didn't question it. Listen, I drove until the canyon was a distant memory, the horizon opening up before me. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching, that someday, somewhere, the whispers will start again. My name is Melissa Potter. I'm 35 years old, and this happened last December in Blackwater Falls State Park, West Virginia. I had just landed my first solo freelance assignment, a travel feature for an outdoor magazine. It was my chance to prove to myself and maybe to a few others that I could thrive on my own after leaving a toxic relationship. I didn't expect the park's breathtaking beauty to be marred by whispers of the past, or that those whispers would grow louder with each passing night. When I first arrived, the park was everything I'd hoped for. My RV fit snugly into a secluded campsite overlooking the gorge, the roar of the falls constant in the distance. Blackwater Falls was a photographer's dream, cascading water, mist rising through the gorge, and vibrant autumn foliage painted in fiery reds and oranges. The first day was perfect. I hiked, shot hundreds of photos, and scribbled notes about the trails and wildlife. The peace and quiet were a balm, exactly what I needed after months of turmoil. That evening, I sat by the fire, sipping tea and scrolling through my shots. That's when I saw it for the first time. At the edge of one frame, a figure stood between two trees. It was a man, his clothes ragged and his face shadowed. I frowned, zooming in, but the details remained blurred. I didn't remember seeing anyone during my hike, and the figure hadn't appeared in any other photos. I shook it off as an optical illusion, probably a trick of light and shadow, and went to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The second day brought strange encounters. I started the morning by stopping at the visitor center, hoping to get some local insight. The woman behind the counter, Maggie, was friendly but seemed to be watching me too closely. She eyed my camera gear and smiled knowingly. "Planning to photograph the falls?" she asked. "That's the idea," I replied. Maggie hesitated, her smile faltering. "Be careful around the falls, especially near dusk. The dead don't like company." I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Before I could ask more, she turned to help another guest, leaving me with a vague unease. Later, on a trail to the falls, I ran into Gary, a park ranger. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a genial demeanor. As he gave me a quick overview of the park's history, I brought up Maggie's warning. He chuckled. "Oh, that's just local folklore. Back in the Civil War, there was a Confederate soldier who hid out in the gorge. They say he deserted his regiment and was hunted down near the falls. Some folks claim his spirit never left. But I've worked here for years and never seen a thing." I tried to laugh with him, but his words stayed with me. That evening, the first real sign of something unnatural occurred. I set up my tripod near the falls, hoping to capture the golden hour light. As I framed the shot, my breath caught. The air around me had turned frigid, my breath fogging in front of me despite the mild weather. My camera refused to focus, the lens shuddering as if something was blocking it. And then, faint but unmistakable, I heard whispers. I spun around, expecting to see other hikers, but I was alone. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and indecipherable, like a crowd speaking just out of earshot. The unease became unbearable, and I packed up in a rush, leaving the falls as the last light of day faded. That night, Back at the RV, I reviewed the day's photos. Most were stunning, the falls bathed in warm golden light. But in 3 of them, the figure from the previous day appeared again. This time, he was closer, standing at the edge of the water. His face was clearer now, pale, gaunt, with dark hollows where his eyes should have been, and in the last photo, he was staring directly at the camera. I slammed my laptop shut and locked the RV door. The next morning, I debated cutting the trip short, but a part of me couldn't let it go. I'd always prided myself on being rational, and I wasn't going to let a few strange occurrences ruin my assignment. While hiking near the falls, I noticed an overgrown side trail. Curiosity tugged at me, and I followed it, ducking beneath low-hanging branches. It led to a clearing where the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. In the center of the clearing was a patch of disturbed earth, as though something had been buried there long ago. Nearby, I found an object half buried in the dirt, a weathered leather journal. The pages were brittle but legible, written in a looping, old-fashioned script. The entries told the story of a Confederate soldier who had deserted his regiment and fled into the gorge. His words were filled with fear and desperation. The nights grow colder and I hear them coming. I cannot outrun my fate. The last entry read, "They will find me tonight. I will not see another sunrise." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the oppressive feeling returned. The RV's lights flickered, and shadows danced across the walls, moving in ways that didn't match the firelight outside. And then I saw him. The soldier stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. He didn't move, didn't blink, but his hollow eyes locked onto mine. My chest tightened with fear as I realized he wasn't alone. Shadows emerged from the trees, darker and more twisted, their forms writhing like smoke. They whispered accusations, voices overlapping in a cacophony. "Traitor! Coward! You will not leave." Panicking, I grabbed the journal and held it up. "Is this what you want?" I shouted. The soldier's expression shifted. Sadness, perhaps gratitude, and he gestured toward the disturbed earth I'd seen earlier. I understood. Clutching the journal, I ran back to the clearing. The shadows followed, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. My hands shook as I placed the journal on the grave and whispered a quiet prayer for peace. The air around me grew still. The shadows stopped, their forms dissolving into the night. The soldier lingered for a moment longer, his hollow eyes softening before fading into the mist. By morning, the oppressive feeling had lifted. The forest seemed brighter, the air lighter, and for the first time in days, I felt safe. Before leaving, I stopped at the visitor center to return the journal. Maggie was there, her knowing smile greeting me. "You helped him, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, unsure how to respond. She reached out, patting my hand. "He's free now. You did a good thing." As I drove away from Blackwater Falls, I realized the experience had changed me. I didn't have all the answers, but I no longer felt the weight of doubt and fear that had followed me into the park. Sometimes the past lingers in ways we can't explain, and sometimes all it takes to move forward is to lay it to rest. I had been staring at the sinkhole for hours. The edges of the earth had crumbled away into a perfect, jagged circle, leaving nothing but a gaping void beneath me. It was unnervingly symmetrical, as though the ground hadn't collapsed on its own, but had been carved out by something, or someone. I crouched at the edge, carefully adjusting my geological scanner, but the equipment was giving me nothing but static. The readings were all over the place. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, tapping the scanner in frustration. I hadn't come all the way to Hollow Creek for faulty data. I took a deep breath and scanned the horizon. The thick pines loomed like sentinels around the campground, the pale light of late afternoon casting long shadows across the landscape. My RV sat parked a short distance away, looking small and vulnerable against the vast wilderness of Chugach National Forest. It was a beautiful place, no doubt. Quiet, remote, exactly what I needed to clear my head. But the silence had a weight to it, an unnatural stillness that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I was here on a solo trip, tasked with investigating the sudden appearance of several sinkholes that had been forming in the area. Geological instability was the theory, but something about the way these holes formed had raised red flags from the moment I arrived. The patterns were too precise, too deliberate. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Ethan, the local park ranger, and the closest thing to human contact I'd had in days. His voice crackled through the static as I picked up. "Hey, Megan, how's it going out there?" "Not great," I admitted. "The equipment's glitching again, and these sinkholes, I don't know. They feel weird. Not like anything I've seen before." Ethan chuckled, but there was an edge to it. Hollow Creek's always been strange. You wouldn't be the first to think something's off here. "What do you mean?" I asked, standing up and dusting off my jeans. "You ever hear the stories about this place?" Locals believe the sinkholes are more than just geological shifts. They think there's something ancient beneath the earth. The indigenous people used to call it the land that breathes. They thought the earth here was alive, that it could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. I rolled my eyes, though the words stirred an uneasy feeling deep in my gut. "Sounds like folklore to me." "Maybe," Ethan said, his tone serious now. "But I'd be careful if I were you. These woods have a way of playing tricks on you. And the sinkholes, well, they've taken people before. People who didn't listen to the warnings." I didn't respond right away, staring down into the abyss of the sinkhole in front of me. I'd studied rocks and underground formations for most of my career, but nothing had prepared me for the unnerving stillness of this place. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "But I'm here to study geology, not ghosts." Ethan sighed. "Just don't go too deep, okay? Call if you need anything." I hung up and pocketed the phone, but the conversation lingered in my mind. The land that breathes. Superstition, I told myself. Just old stories. I turned back to the sinkhole. Something inside me itched to see what was beneath the surface, to understand what was causing the ground to shift in such a strange, unnatural way. The patterns in the rocks I had been studying weren't like any natural formation I'd seen before. There were spirals, perfectly etched into the stone, as though by design, not by nature. The deeper I looked, the more I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't meant to find. That night, the first signs of trouble came in the form of noise, a low, deep rumbling that vibrated through the ground like the hum of a giant unseen machine. It started just as I was finishing dinner, sitting by the campfire. So the sounds blended into the whispering wind at first, but then it grew louder, more distinct, like a deep pulse coming from below. I stood, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The stars were barely visible, shrouded in the thick clouds that seemed to roll in out of nowhere. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps, something moving in the dark. "Ethan?" I called, my voice small against the vast silence. Nothing. I walked toward the sinkhole, my stomach knotting with every step. The rumbling grew louder, and as I reached the edge, I felt it, vibrations under my feet. The ground beneath me was shifting, alive. I shone my flashlight down into the hole, but the beam disappeared into the blackness, swallowed by the depths. I knelt, running my hand along the edge. The earth was soft, loose, as though it had only recently begun to settle after something had disturbed it. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. I scrambled backward, heart racing, just as a section of the earth collapsed, sending a cascade of dirt and rocks into the sinkhole. I fell onto my back, gasping for air, watching as the hole grew wider, deeper, like a hungry mouth devouring the ground. Adrenaline pumped through me as I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a geological phenomenon. Something was moving beneath the surface, something massive. I rushed back to the RV, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically as I fumbled for the key. But as I reached the door, the ground shook again, harder this time. The sinkhole was growing fast. I had to leave now. But then a thought struck me. What if I was right? What if this was something no one had ever discovered before? If I could just capture proof, if I could document what was really happening here, my work would be revolutionary. I would be vindicated. My mind flashed back to the spirals in the rock, the patterns that had seemed too deliberate to be natural. There was something ancient beneath the earth, and I was so close. I grabbed my gear and rushed back to the edge of the sinkhole. My heart pounded in my chest as I descended carefully into the darkness, lowering myself into the opening. The air grew colder as I went deeper. The walls of the hole were damp and slick beneath my hands. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the bottom. The cavern was vast, much larger than I had anticipated. My flashlight illuminated jagged rock formations, but it was the carvings on the walls that caught my breath. Symbols, spirals etched deep into the stone. They were everywhere, ancient and deliberate. This wasn't just a natural formation. This was a structure, a temple of some kind, buried deep beneath the earth for centuries, maybe longer. I pulled out my camera, hands trembling, and began to record. But as I did, a low, resonating sound filled the cavern, a rhythmic pulse like the beating of a massive heart. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, the ground shifting beneath my feet. And then from the shadows, I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the deeper recesses of the cavern. Something was moving toward me. Something massive. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the stone walls. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever was in the darkness, it was getting closer. I could feel its presence, a weight in the air, a primal force that made my skin crawl. The footsteps stopped, and then a deep, guttural growl echoed through the cavern. I ran. I didn't look back. The ground trembled beneath me as I scrambled up the wall of the sinkhole, my hands slipping on the loose earth. The growling grew louder, closer, until I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. I burst out of the sinkhole, gasping for air, and ran toward the RV. The ground shook violently, and as I reached the door, I glanced back. The sinkhole was collapsing in on itself, the earth swallowing it whole. But for a split second, I saw something. Something massive, serpentine, rising from the depths before it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't wait. I threw open the door, started the engine, and sped away, leaving Hollow Creek behind me. By the time I reached the main road, my heart had finally begun to slow. I was alive. I had made it. But the images of that cavern, those symbols, haunted my mind. I had uncovered something ancient, that wasn't meant to be found. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that should have stayed buried, something that was still there, waiting beneath the earth, and I knew one thing for certain: I wouldn't be going back.